Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today, continuing on with the Booker Longlist, I am going to be talking about Pearl by Hughes. And this was in many ways, I think, a fair few people's surprise one on the list, mostly because it's from a smaller press. And I think as a result, it's a book that fewer people knew about going into the prize. But I am delighted that it made it, actually. I think it has ended up being one of the books that I'd really love to see in the shortlist. So let's talk a little bit about it. As always with Booker Longlist things and just sort of solo book reviews, I'll be going into some spoilers later in the video, but what I'll do is the first section will be spoiler free, at least basically anything that you could get reading the blurb, and anything after that will be kind of marked as being within the spoiler part. So feel free to join for the first part while I talk about this book, and then come in towards the spoiler part late afterwards, after you've read the book, perhaps, if you want to as well. Anyway, let's get started with this. So Pearl is the story of Marianne, and we meet her in two main sort of stages of her life, really, but sort of various other bits in between. So we have this sort of Marianne, who at 8 years old is left by her mother. Her mother goes missing, and we sort of get the story that spins out off of this big traumatic event for her. We then also have Marianne sort of looking back from more of the kind of current day, as an adult. And we get a little bit in between as well of Marianne in her teenage years and sort of going through various other bits. We sort of get references to things that have happened and various challenges she's had. And it's worth noting right from the beginning, partly because of that topic of the story and various other things, it's not a happy story in many ways, but I think it's incredibly powerful and incredibly sensitively done, at least that I found. I think because the book copes with the ways that people respond to trauma and the ways they respond to some of the most difficult things in their life happening. A key component of this is the way, and the thing that I really enjoyed about the book, is the way this book balances innocence and experience. And so the way that, for example, Marianne as a young girl tries to process various things around her, what she understands and doesn't understand, and what as an adult she can look back on and maybe have new eyes on. So sort of suddenly seeing the kind of stress points in her life that would maybe make her think of doing something quite drastic. And so what we get really then as a result is this figure of Marianne, who's incredibly complex and really, it's a really interesting character study into her and what makes her tick. So she is attempting to piece together something that feels like she has no closure. And in doing so, she really is forced to go back over a lot of things that have happened in her life and either recontextualize them with sort of finding out maybe what the real story is versus what she'd been told at the time, but also really trying to understand the weight of this for her, what it's done to her, how it's impacted her life. And I think a key component of this story that I think was really well handled is how it does that also through things like nursery rhymes and poems and tales. So the title of this story is taken from a medieval poem, and part of the poem's plot, part of the story's plot, is that she is working to do something with it. She's trying to recontextualize that itself. She's trying to take something and build something new out of it, and kind of reappreciate it in that way. And there's an interesting parallel, I think, through the story for how she's trying to cope with her own grief and her own understanding of the world and of what's happened. But I think what also is so fascinating about this is how those are dropped into the book. And I think at first I couldn't always grasp how the nursery rhymes or the more sing-song bits sort of worked in this story, but actually it really built up a rhythm that I came to really love and appreciate by the end of this book. I think, for example, so this is not, I don't believe in the book, but something that I think is a good version of really how we think about this is nursery rhymes themselves seem incredibly innocent but have a lot of darkness underneath them. So if we take Ring a Ring of Roses, quite popular in the UK at one point, I don't know if it still is, I feel old saying that, but that's something that people would sing, and its origins came from the fact that people were dying of like during the Black Death, like, and as a result there was the stench of bodies all around, of sort of people dying, and hence the posies that people had in their pocket, to kind of also sort of have as this smell to distract them, to sort of hide the smell of everything else going on. The end of Ring a Ring of Roses is we all fall down, and this is people dying, and those kinds of fairy tales and stories have so much darkness to them, but were in some ways a way of dealing with the far too real and far too big and complicated and dark things around them. And in many ways, I think this is a real strength of the book, that these fairy tales and nursery rhymes and things like this are peppered in, because often there'll be something incredibly harrowing going on, and the insertion of a nursery rhyme or parts of this poem kind of throw us out of that, but also help us recontextualize it. They are maybe, somebody talking about wanting to feel free, or somebody wanting to experience joy, and maybe the joy only comes from the escapism of thinking about this nursery rhyme, but actually that escapism has something dark lingering underneath the surface anyway. Equally, some of them help really add joy when there are these moments of levity during the book. And I think for such a short book, I think it does something really quite interesting in how it manages to bring in these really varied layers of meaning into some of those things. Because I was listening to this as an audiobook, and something that was quite startling at times was to go from something incredibly dark and difficult, and then have a character think about these really fun, silly childhood games. But in many ways, that's innocence and experience all over again. There's 8-year-old Marianne unable to understand what's going on around her and having to trust the words of people around her. And there's Marianne as an adult, trying to make sense of everything that's gone on. And it's difficult to talk a bit more about some of these other bits without going into spoilers. So let's pause the spoiler. Well, let's bring down the spoiler curtain here. But basically just to say, I think this is a really underrated gem on this list. Again, this is why I love prize lists, because even if you don't necessarily agree with all of the lists themselves, often something like Pearl would not have been, maybe wouldn't have been as big, or had as much attention. It's not a book I think I'd have come across had it not been for this. So I'm really delighted that it has been given this little platform, particularly for an indie press. And so, I think this is a beautiful little book, and I really do urge you to check it out if you think it'd be of interest. And with that, I'm going to go into some spoilers. So feel free to log off now if you need to. If not, I'll see you in just a sec. So, on the more spoilery side of things, there's not a great deal that I'd want to go into in terms of breaking down, but part of her not being able to adjust and not being able to deal with things in the world is really sort of really manifests itself in a lot of her behavior. We learn a lot about the ways that she is suddenly cruel to herself in some ways, these sort of self-destructive behaviors of either barely eating, of inflicting damage to her body in various ways, the ways that she throws herself almost as this slightly passive object between these dark and difficult situations, the way she lurches at this sort of passive creature. And it makes it just so complicated and tricky. But equally, there's some kind of sense of hope. She is really looking to the future to try to imagine how she might continue to live and how she might process everything that's gone on. She can't quite piece things together at first. It seems incredibly difficult for her to imagine a future where this is ever resolved. And in many ways, the book resists fairly neat and easy resolution. Because with something like her mother having gone missing, what is a good resolution? Her finding her mother is dead, her finding her mother is alive, and is still sort of on the loose, her mother still being missing, her mother hating her. Which of these scenarios would give her peace? In many ways, none of them. And that's part of the thing that she's reckoning with, that she can't really, some of these things might help her feel better, but actually that this needs to be a self-driven thing. It can't be just finding out a piece of information from the outside world. It needs to be what she does next with that information. And I think that's what's really quite beautiful about the way that this book has Marianne have a project in terms of her work with this idea of Pearl, and sort of doing things with it. Because it seems to give her a purpose and a focus, but equally at the same time, what can she do with that? Does she have enough to keep moving forward? And that's what I thought was really quite profound and quite beautiful about this book, is the way it resists that easiness. It makes us realize by the end of this book that really this is something she has to do herself, and it is not going to be easy. But Marianne has in many ways had to face down some of the worst parts already. She's already been dealing with the fallout from it, from the trauma of various things, and now it's just about what she does next. And I get the feeling that she's a character who will keep on singing these sorts of nursery rhymes and still carry on trying to find the joy and innocence that was maybe robbed of her when she was just a young girl and had to go through this. All of this is to make this book sound incredibly moribund and sad. I think it has a lot of that, obviously, given the subject matter, but I think it's way beyond that. I think this is a really sensitive and beautiful book. I think ultimately there's quite a lot of hope in this book, as much as it doesn't often feel it. I think there's also a lot of joy and humour to be found, and I just found it a really special book in many, many ways, that I've been thinking about a fair bit since. So I'd be really delighted to see this on the shortlist. But either way, I think it's just such a great thing to see a small indie press have a book like this. You know, small indie presses are often the ones doing the hard work of finding incredible stuff like this, and bringing out a book like this, and then it being given this wonderful platform to shine. I think it's a really special book, and I really hope that more people read it. If this sounds like something you'd like, I hope you read it too. Take care, either way. I've been Bob, talking about the book A Longlist, Kill Surprise. Take care, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.